On some mornings, wealth announces itself loudly. Private terminals, dark SUVs, people who float through security on first-name terms with the staff. On this morning, it did not. The man most responsible for keeping one particular jet in the air arrived at the airport in the same way he had flown as a broke college student, early, quiet, and a little tired. His name was David Cole. He was in his mid-40s, black, and dressed in the kind of way that made people underestimate him if they were not paying attention. Dark jeans, soft leather shoes, a navy blazer over a simple shirt, no watch that screamed for attention, no logo that hinted at net worth. He carried two things, a slim black carry-on and a laptop bag that had seen more hotel rooms than most people see in a decade. The flight that morning was not strictly private, not in the celebrity sense. It was a high-end business route, run by a major airline, but operated with a small sub-fleet configured for fewer passengers and more space. Tickets were expensive. Seats were wide. Most people in the cabin were used to being treated as if their time mattered more than most. David had seen the aircraft before, but never from this side of the boarding pass. His company specialized in charter operations. They did not own planes outright, at least not yet, but they managed routes, crews, and leasing arrangements. They moved money, contracts, and schedules in complicated patterns that most passengers never saw. This particular jet was under a long-term agreement that his firm had helped negotiate. In practical terms, he was a part owner of the revenue that flowed every time it left the ground. But the cabin crew that day did not know his name. To them, he was just another passenger on the manifest, a black man flying alone in a space where most people looked slightly different and carried themselves with a different kind of entitlement. Boarding was through a separate jet bridge, directly into the small first-class cabin. Soft light, muted colors, a carefully tuned soundtrack playing at a volume that said, "This is not economy." David stepped in, greeted the flight attendant at the door with a nod and a quiet, "Good morning," and found his seat. 2A. Window. Plenty of legroom, a large screen, a crisp white pillow waiting. He stowed his carry-on neatly, placed his laptop bag upright, and sat down. Years of travel had taught him how to make a space feel temporary and functional in seconds. He adjusted the seat belt, powered on his phone to send a last email, and exhaled. The first signal that this day would not go quietly was small. The flight attendant at the door, a white woman in her 30s with immaculate hair and a practiced professional smile, glanced at him once, then again. She looked towards the galley, then back at him. There was a slight tightening around her mouth that experience had taught him to recognize. He had seen that look in hotel lobbies, at rental car counters, and in first-class boarding lines. It was the look of someone mentally checking their internal list of what belonged and what did not. The second signal was not small. She approached his seat with the polite urgency of someone convinced they were about to correct a mistake. Her tone was formal. The words were standard. The content was not. She asked for his boarding pass. He handed it over, calm, watching. She inspected it carefully, then looked at the seat number, then at him. The lines on her forehead deepened. She explained that there might be a mix-up. This section was reserved for specific fare classes and elite customers. There was a possibility, she suggested, that he was meant to be in another part of the aircraft. Her phrasing danced around the assumption, but the meaning was clear. In her mind, the man and the seat did not match. David had a choice in that moment. He could do what many people in his position have done to avoid a scene, laugh it off, insist on being treated correctly, endure the quiet humiliation, and let the story become one more anecdote told over dinner. He had done versions of that before. It left a residue each time. This time, something in the situation felt different. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the interior. He knew this configuration because he had helped choose elements of it from a spreadsheet months before. Perhaps it was the knowledge that his firm had signed off on the maintenance plan that made this flight possible. Or perhaps it was simply that he was tired of watching the same pattern play out in different uniforms. He asked her, calmly, to scan the boarding pass again. She did, using the device at her hip. The system confirmed his seat. The small screen did not care about her assumptions. It only recognized data and transactions. He watched closely as she processed the conflict between the two. The airline system saying one thing, her internal system saying another. The correct response at that point would have been simple. Apologize, step back, and let the morning continue. That was not what happened. Instead, she shifted to another script. She mentioned possible operational needs in the cabin. There was a chance, she said, that they might need his seat for a certain status passenger or a company VIP. She wondered if he would be willing to move, only temporarily, of course, to a different seat further back. Perhaps an upgraded economy position with extra legroom. The subtext was thinner now. The story on the surface was about logistics. Beneath that surface, it was about who she instinctively believed should be at the front of this aircraft. Other passengers were settling in. A man in a tailored suit pretended not to listen while clearly listening. A woman in a sharp dress glanced over the top of her magazine, eyes flicking between the attendant and David. No one spoke, but the cabin noticed. David held her gaze and let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he declined the move. He reminded her that the seat was his, that he had paid for the ticket in full, and that he was not interested in being downgraded. Her professional smile thinned further. She moved away. The plane continued boarding. Doors closed. Safety demonstrations began. On the surface, the problem seemed to resolve itself. David kept his seat. The engines spooled up. The runway approached. But the interaction had already left a mark on the morning. In another life, he might have closed his eyes at that point and tried to let it go. In this one, the memory of that brief exchange settled instead into a new category in his mind, something to address with more than an angry email. The flight itself was uneventful. Breakfast was served on white dishes. The coffee was acceptable. The clouds under the wing moved in the slow, endless way they always did. The attendant who had challenged him continued to perform her tasks with efficiency, approaching his seat as little as possible beyond what was required. He noticed that she seemed more relaxed with other passengers. There, the small talk flowed more easily. The smiles came faster. The body language opened up. With him, politeness stayed rigid and careful, like a mask that had been put back on after slipping once. What she did not know, what made this particular story take a sharper turn than most, was that this flight was not just carrying him as a customer, it was also carrying him as a stakeholder. At their destination, the plane rolled to a stop at a smaller terminal used for premium routes. Passengers disembarked, pulling sleek carry-ons behind them. David walked out with the rest, checked his watch, and headed not toward the main exits, but toward an unmarked office corridor. He had a meeting scheduled upstairs with a mid-level manager from the airline and 2 representatives from his own company. The agenda was supposed to be about route performance and future capacity. It acquired a new item as he walked. They gathered in a modest conference room with a pot of coffee and a view of the tarmac. The airline manager opened a laptop, ready to discuss load factors and fuel costs. Before they reached the second bullet point, David redirected the conversation. He described in steady detail what had happened during boarding. He did not embellish. He did not need to. The sequence itself was enough. A black passenger in first class, an immediate assumption of error, a request to move him further back under the vague cover of operational needs. The persistence of the challenge, even after the boarding pass scanner confirmed his seat. Then he added context. He explained that this was not his first time seeing behavior like this, not as a partner, but as a traveler. He talked about patterns, not one dramatic outburst, but 1,000 small acts that communicated the same message to black passengers over and over. You do not look like you belong here. You must prove, again and again, that your presence is legitimate. The manager listened, uncomfortable. At first, there was an attempt to respond with standard customer service language, regrets, apologies, assurances that this did not reflect company values. David let those words pass without reaction. Then he shifted the ground further. He reminded the manager of the contractual structure behind the flight they had just discussed. He outlined the revenue share, the lease terms, the performance bonuses. He pointed out that his firm did not merely buy tickets. It helped make the very existence of that route financially viable. In simple terms, he was not just a passenger. He was one of the people paying the bills that allowed this flight attendant to have a job. The room changed. What had been a complaint suddenly became a governance issue. It moved from the realm of how do we smooth this over for a customer into how do we explain this to a partner whose continued cooperation affects our assets. Eventually, as these things do, the matter moved up the chain. Internal emails circulated. The incident was logged. The flight attendant was interviewed. Her recollection, predictably, emphasized concern about seat assignments, loyalty tiers, and possible irregularities with the manifest. At no point did she use the word bias. She did not believe she was prejudiced. She believed she was protecting the cabin from confusion. This, David knew, was part of the problem. The most damaging behaviors rarely came from people who thought of themselves as villains. They came from people who believed they were simply doing their job, following their instincts, keeping order. He did not ask for her to be fired. That would have been satisfying in the short term, but useless in the long one. There would always be another flight, another crew member, another moment when someone's unexamined assumptions collided with a passenger's humanity. Instead, he asked for something harder. He pressed for a complete review of the airline's training on customer interactions in premium cabins, with a specific focus on racial bias and the kinds of micro-judgments that lead to incidents like his. He requested that his company be involved in the redesign of those modules, not because he wanted to write them himself, but because he wanted a seat at the table where priorities were set. It was not a small ask. It implied that the airline's current approach was insufficient. It suggested that one of their own partners did not trust them to handle these issues without oversight. At first, there was resistance. Training was expensive, schedules were tight, feedback from crews was always full of complaints about information overload. There were also quieter objections, the unspoken ones, a fear of admitting that the problem was systemic, not occasional. David stayed patient but firm. He reminded them of stories that had hit the news in recent years, incidents where passengers of color were challenged, removed, or humiliated over suspicions that later collapsed under scrutiny. He did not need to name airlines. The executives in the room knew how quickly reputations could be damaged in the age of camera phones and social media. Then, he offered them something they understood well: a risk calculation. They could treat his experience as a one-off and attempt to appease him alone. Or they could treat it as a free preview of bigger failures waiting to happen if they did not act. Eventually, the balance tipped. A working group was formed, consisting of airline training specialists, outside consultants, and one representative from David's company. Case studies were collected. Not the sensational viral incidents, but the quieter stories that never reached headlines. Gate agents who second-guessed upgrades. Cabin crew who probed certain passengers more aggressively about baggage and boarding groups. Subtle patterns in who was offered help and who was watched. The new training that emerged from those sessions looked different. Instead of a few lines in a general manual, bias awareness became a distinct, recurring topic. Cabin crew were asked to examine their own reactions to different faces in the same seats. Role-playing scenarios were updated to include premium cabins and ambiguous situations that mirrored reality. One module, which David quietly insisted on, focused specifically on the moment when a staff member's instincts and the computer system disagree. In those scenarios, the correct response was no longer to trust your gut over the scanner. It was to recognize that the gut might be shaped by decades of seeing certain people as out of place in certain spaces. The flight attendant from that morning attended some of those sessions. She was not singled out publicly. Her name was not used as a cautionary tale. But she sat and listened as instructors described behaviors that matched her own. She watched videos where actors reenacted scenes that felt uncomfortably familiar. A black passenger being challenged in first class, a Latino businessman being asked repeatedly to prove he belonged in the priority line, a black woman questioned about her seat in an exit row. At first, she defended herself internally. She had not meant harm. She had been trying to protect the experience for all passengers. She had been thinking of procedure. Slowly, under the pressure of repetition and reflection, Another realization began to creep in. Her idea of normal had been narrow. Her sense of who looked like a premium customer had been shaped by years of seeing certain races and incomes paired together. There was an exercise at the end of one session. Crew members were shown photos of people in everyday clothing and asked, quickly, to mentally place them into cabins: economy, business, first, private. Not as policy, but as a mirror. Many of them, including her, realized how quickly and unconsciously they sorted faces based on race, age, and style. The realization stung. That sting, if taken seriously, could turn into change. Months later, on another route, in another first-class cabin, a different black passenger took his seat near the front. He wore a hoodie and carried a backpack. His boarding pass clearly showed 1C. The flight attendant on duty, this time a man, felt the old reflex tug.